Now it's my honor to introduce Audrey Moore. Audrey is a co-founder of Precious Dirt and STOP, which stands for Standing Together to Outlaw Pesticides. She is also co-founder of Freedom from Pesticides Alliance. Along with other Josephine County residents, Audrey is currently gathering signatures for the Freedom from Pesticides Bill of Rights initiative to ban corporate and governmental entities from spraying toxic pesticides within Josephine County. Please welcome Audrey Moore.
Thank you, Michelle. It's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be in the position that I've been given this evening. As she said, back in January of 2011, I received a phone call that they were going to be spraying atrazine by helicopter, no less, in my neighborhood, less than 2 miles from my home. To make a long story short, that began a process of much research, and I then became an activist. I went from a retiree to a woman who's going, how is it possible that highly toxic chemicals can be sprayed by helicopter where we live? Only to find out that Oregon has an insidious history of over 30 years of doing this. It used to be Agent Orange. So to make a long story short, we did the research. We did what all communities do. We went first to the mill and tried to sit down and have a civil conversation and present stacks of the science that showed that what they were doing was hazardous to our health as well as the health of our air, water, and soil. That didn't work. It was a steel wall. We were invited to the clear cut. We then went to the commissioners. We went to the local council. We went to the state. We actually went, she mentioned that I'm part of an organization called STOP, Standing Together to Outlaw Pesticides. We actually went all the way to the governor's office and spoke with the natural resource advisor to try to get the chemicals, in particular at the time, timber sprays, from stopping, because they're happening right next to where people live and children play. We were turned down. We were told, in fact, his hands were tied by timber. So we hit rock bottom. I did. I know Aaron, my partner in both groups, or at least in STOP, we both hit rock bottom. It was like, now what? We've done everything we possibly could within the system to try to get the poisons to stop, and nothing was working. It was one steel wall after another. Then in 2013, I went to the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference, and Thomas Lindsay happened to be the keynote speaker. And he started off speaking my language. He actually quoted Derek Jensen, who, ironically, I had just started reading 6 months earlier and was now my new favorite author. But he started off by saying, we're fucked. Yep. And I was like, wow, yeah, I just found that out after 3 years of work. And his speech then was the light at the end of the tunnel, if you will. Because for the first time, I realized there was possibly a path out of this quagmire. A path forward that gave us back our rights, a path that said, no, we don't have to put up with corporate entities and state empowering them to do things that are harmful to both ourselves as well as our communities. So with that, I made a phone call after hearing his speech, and in less than a month, they were in my valley, the Illinois Valley. We changed or created a new organization called the Freedom from Pesticides Alliance, and in 6 months, we drafted our initiative to ban pesticides in Josephine County. As far as I'm concerned, personally, there's only one practical, logical method based on my years of experience, and I'm now in my 4th year, of getting us out of the box, the quagmire that we're now stuck in, and it's the cell death path. And with that, I am honored. It is my deep pleasure to introduce to you the gentleman who is making it happen on the cell death path, Mr. Thomas Lindsay, who was the light at the end of the tunnel that helped me realize that we don't have to quit, we don't have to lay down in front of the tank, we don't have to take what is being dropped on us and forced on us by corporations and our state. There is a path out, and that path is being led by Thomas Lindsay. And with that, I'd like to introduce Thomas Lindsay.
You know, the last time I was in Eugene was at the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference, and if I was a betting man, before I accepted the invitation to speak there, which was offered by Zach Baker. I don't know if anybody knows Zach. Yeah. I turned Zach down 5 different times when they offered the invitation because we don't speak to environmental lawyers anymore. I spent 5 years trying to talk to environmental lawyers and environmental law professors, and we would give talks where they would walk out of the room halfway through because they were so invested in this environmental regulatory system, permit appeals and begging and pleading state officials to do the right thing and for agencies to do the right thing. And so I just stopped talking to them. And Zach was like, well, this might be different, come on in. If I was a betting man, I would have said I would have carried out on a rail that day because they're just not the constituency that can hear what we're saying. Increasingly, that's changing. Professor Mary Wood, other environmental law professors across the country are actually beginning to talk some of that language about environmental law being a failure, that it's all about regulating the rate at which we destroy nature, but it's not about actually protecting nature. And so some of that is starting to seep up from perhaps the least likely of places, which is the environmental law community. So tonight, in preparation for the talk, I asked some of the Benton County folks and Josephine County folks and Lane County folks where stuff's happening in Oregon along community rights and rights-based ordinance and that type of work. I asked them for their opinion. What do you guys want to hear tonight? What do you want to be immersed in? And the person that sent me back the most detailed message was Ann Nealon. She's standing in the back. She's in the brown sweater back there, and we traded a couple of emails, which I've kept. I printed them out because I want to look at them later. And she said, well, we want you to talk about how you got started in doing the regulatory system and how the regulatory system really sucks because it doesn't give us what we want. And we want you to talk about corporate constitutional rights and the Commerce Clause and personhood rights. And we also want you to talk about Dillon's rule, which is very important. And preemption, we'd like you to talk about that too. Oh, and don't forget the history of the United States Constitution. We want you to talk about that. And even more important than that is the abolitionists and the suffragists. We want you to tell the history of how they got involved in this work and about how this work kind of mirrors some of what they did. So the bad news is we're going to be here for about 8 hours tonight. Yeah. So, and the good news is I think we have some Cliff Bars stashed somewhere. So if people get hungry, I think we can take care of that. So I don't get out much anymore. For a number of years working with the Legal Defense Fund, I was on the road one year, 250 some days out of that year. In different time zones and hotels, and you wake up and you don't know which time zone you're in. And I figured out at some point that was for much younger people than I. And so they keep me mostly at the office now. I don't get to come out and give talks or meet a lot of the communities that we work with, which is strange because in the beginning I was the primary contact for all those communities. Increasingly, when I go out and talk, I don't like to give speeches anymore because I think speeches are so limited. I mean, it's basically about getting people excited, which is pretty easy to do because we live in such fucked up times that basically, you can say almost anything of hope and people will get excited. But then they leave the room and then they don't do anything because there's nothing to connect them into and there's no deeper understanding of those types of things. So increasingly, I'm trying to engage rather than just do a one-sided delivery here because the work is not one-sided. It's not our organization as the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, which has pioneered some of this community rights-based work across the United States, but we're not the final word. I mean, in fact, we change our minds every couple weeks. We now have 13 lawyers working for us in different capacities. And lawyers change their mind every 45 seconds. And so in the office, we have these, beat down fights over stuff that a lot of people would just find very strange. Like, you know, what's Article 1, Section 2 of the Oregon Constitution actually mean, you know, and collective rights and individual rights, and what are rights of nature, what the hell does that mean? And having conversations about how far that reaches and how that's balanced in different ways by other rights. Increasingly, when we go out and speak, whether it's me or the staff or the lawyers that we have, we basically present some very uncomfortable truths. Okay? We're the deliverer of uncomfortable truths a lot of times to audiences that we talk to. And one of the biggest uncomfortable truths of them all in the United States, this is the whopper, you know, of uncomfortable truths, is that we don't make the decisions in our own communities about what happens in those communities anymore, right? We lack, as people, the legal, constitutional, or political authority to actually make decisions in our own communities that stick, okay? And we see that most often when decisions that we want to make run frontally up against a system of law that's been put in place to actually advance the rights of corporations, and in some ways higher units of government that corporations are using against us. And so when we do work on GMOs or fracking or water withdrawals or stopping the coal trains, you know, in Bellingham we worked with this great group of people in Bellingham, Washington to actually develop an ordinance that would ban coal trains from coming through the town, right?
Yay, Bellingham.
Yeah, yay the people of Bellingham. And what they learned very quickly was that the entire system of law is set up to squash them, right? Because you and I are not supposed to have the type of expertise or knowledge or decision making that is actually intended to stick under the constitutional system of law that we have. In essence, when we make a decision in our community, it's the first inning of a 9-inning ball game. And the decision that we make in our community doesn't stick unless it passes certain filters. And one of those filters is corporate rights. So if it runs counter to corporate rights, it can be struck down. If it runs counter to what the state has done or what the state has told your community that it can do, then it gets struck down. If it runs counter to federal preemption, something the federal government has done that it runs up against, then it can be struck down. Basically, our lawmaking within our community is just like an opinion that we give. It's not even law in many ways under this current system that we've been living under. It's just an opinion. We think that GMOs are a bad thing, but we don't have the legal, political, or civil governing authority to actually make that stick under the system that we have. And I'm going to get into some of that tonight because I actually want to pick apart some of the details of how that actually operates. Because as we were talking about an hour ago with a group of folks from the different counties that are doing work in Oregon, that the fact is in the United States today that it doesn't matter what we want. It doesn't matter what we want as people within our communities because we don't have the power to get it. And so we break ourselves down. We censor each other in some ways. We go to conferences where, okay, in this room, we're going to put the water withdrawal folks working on water withdrawals to stop Nestle in the gorge, for example. And over in this room, we're going to put the anti-clear-cut activists. And over here, we're going to put folks working on fracking. And we separate out into all those different rooms. We actually censor ourselves by pretending that all the single issues are different. But in reality, the single issues aren't different at all because they all exist under this superstructure of law that essentially has systematically deprived us of any community decision-making power at all. It doesn't matter whether we think clear-cutting's bad. It doesn't matter whether we think GMOs are bad. It doesn't matter what we think is adverse to our community because we don't have the legal authority to get it. Corporations under our system of law have more rights than the communities in which they operate, right? I don't know about you, but I don't want to live in a community where Monsanto has the legal authority to govern and define what agriculture looks like, right? Does anybody think that the board of directors of Monsanto Corporation gives a shit what the community thinks is good for the community? Or that Monsanto's vision for what they want for that community is the same as the vision for the people that live there? I don't want to live in that world. I don't want to live in the world where Weyerhaeuser comes in and actually defines what forestry is going to look like in my community, right? Or BNS. BNNS Railway Company, which hauls all the coal across Washington State to be shipped to China and Asian countries. I don't want BNSF controlling what can be transported through my community in terms of fossil fuels, which are then being lit on fire to kill all of us, right? I mean, just to be simple in simple terms. I don't want those corporations because those corporations are ostensibly, they have values that are much different than ours. Their reason for being there is to suck the resource out or to use the community to obtain certain goals. But they have no interest in sustainability. They're coming in to get something. Their interest is different from ours. Why would we ever allow them to control our communities, right? But that's where we sit today. We are under their thumb, and their defining of those things governs our own communities. I talk about uncomfortable truths. That is the uncomfortable truth, that we're stuck in that system currently. Of course, other people in the past have also talked about uncomfortable truths. These abolitionists talked about uncomfortable truths. It took the abolitionists 60 years and a civil war to abolish slavery in this country, right? The abolitionist movement started out as 12 people at Oberlin College. That's small, right? They were not just sharing an uncomfortable truth that slavery should be abolished. They were spreading heresy. Because to talk about abolition was unconstitutional and illegal. Slavery was legal in the United States. What they were talking about doing was abolishing slavery, about taking slaves from the slave owners, about taking property from the slave owners. It was unconstitutional and illegal. The suffragists, back in the 1830s, women were considered to be completely property of either the husbands or their brothers. In other words, the oldest male figure in the family. When the suffragists went to cast a vote at the ballot box, like Susan B. Anthony, I have this mental picture of her running to the ballot box as the clerk of elections was trying to stop her. No! As she was trying to put it into the ballot box, which she did. She ran the gauntlet and actually stuck the ballot into the ballot box. And what she got for her efforts was she was arrested and tried and sentenced. In the transcript we use in our democracy schools, the trainings that we do for communities. And because what she was doing was illegal. Illegal and in some ways unconstitutional as well. These truths are not just uncomfortable. They are, in the current system of law that we have, illegal and unconstitutional. It is illegal and unconstitutional for communities to make law in ways that interfere with corporate rights, or the prerogative of state governments to preempt them, other parts of that system of law. So what we're talking about is uncomfortable truths that aren't just uncomfortable in themselves, but actually a legal system that's empowered to actually stop us from doing anything else other than thinking about changing those uncomfortable truths from being true. Right? That's the system we're stuck in. The phrase I used at the PIELC conference was, sustainability is illegal under our system of law. That the system of law is set up to propagate the endless production of more stuff. It doesn't understand limits. It doesn't see limits. They're not incorporated into it. The system of law is about that endless growth. What folks in Benton Lane, Josephine, and other places across the United States are doing currently, which I'm going to talk about next, is actually about saying enough. We're not going to do this anymore. Because if we're going to survive on this planet, we have to find a different way of existing. We need a different legal system. We need to occupy the law. So we have a choice to make about these uncomfortable truths. Many liberals and progressives, the progressive liberal machinery that's out there, the big green environmental groups, they don't even bother to wrestle with the uncomfortable truths. When they come into a situation where something's happening in a community and they come in to assist the community, they go right into this thing called the regulatory system, which has been set up with permits and regulations and limits on emissions and how much you can legally dump into a stream or into the ocean or put on land, those types of things. And then the environmental groups come in and work within that regulatory system. Well, the problem is the regulatory system was built just for us. It was built for us to go through. In fact, for 10 years, the Legal Defense Fund did that work. I'm going to talk about some of that tonight, about how we came to certain conclusions about how that regulatory system works. Someone once said you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. Well, the regulatory system was basically written by the very corporations that ostensibly the regulations are supposed to be regulating within our community. Yet we think we can find some answer or solution within that regulatory system even when we didn't write that script. And to me, that's crazy. That's nuts. And so, you know, these uncomfortable truths, when we come to them, we can either actually engage in them and say, how do we need to change our organizing to recognize those uncomfortable truths and to fix them? Or we can work around them. We can say, yeah, it's too bad that they're uncomfortable truths, but we need to work around them. We need to tweak this or try to appeal this and make the corporation cause a little less harm. That has not worked. It has not worked. You know, 40 years after the major environmental laws passed in this country, things are worse now from almost every major environmental perspective than they were 40 years ago, right? And so we have to understand that, we have to grasp with it, and we actually have to change our organizing. That's a choice that we make. I've run into thousands of people over the past 10 years who don't make that choice. They decide to work within the existing system that they have rather than venturing into something new. If those people were in the 1840s, they wouldn't have been the abolitionists. If they were in the 1820s, they would not have been the suffragists. And by the way, it took 100 years in this country for the suffragists just to get the right to vote, right? For women to get the right to vote in this country. It took 90 years. It took the Quakers and the early folks in the beginning, and then it took the organized suffragist movement. Corporations became persons in this country 40 years before women became persons in this country under the law, right? So, you know, just to get that stuff in perspective, also very uncomfortable truths. So when we began doing this work, we started out not even knowing that those uncomfortable truths existed, right? So we came out of law school and set up an environmental law firm to do environmental law because we thought that the existing environmental laws were great. The problem was they were just not being enforced enough because we didn't have enough environmental lawyers in this country. A lot of people still think that. We did what I would call traditional environmental work for about 8 years. We appealed the shit out of permits. We applied the National Environmental Policy Act. We brought suits under the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and all the state equivalents of those laws within the state of Pennsylvania. We did everything possible under the sun to be creative and cutting edge and all those things with these permits. And we came to a series of conclusions about how the regulatory system actually functions, or some people would say how it doesn't function, at least for us, but functions perfectly well for those who are actually engaged in getting the permit that they need to do X, Y, or Z. In those early days, back in 1995, 1996, when we were first starting out, and just as an aside, we were cleaning out our office because we moved our office within Massachusetts to a different location. Came across my old tax returns for the mid-1990s. And so I graduated from law school in 95. The tax return I had was for 96. It was $978 I made in 1996. So just go on the record about that. Those were not lean years. They were desert years, in terms of not having any money. So when we came out, we opened up our office to provide free legal services to environmental organizations, community-based environmental groups. Because in our understanding in law school is that community groups are the last ones that could afford $400 an hour lawyers to appeal permits or to look over an ordinance or whatever else. Today, my peers in the environmental law field, I have some peers who make $1,000 an hour charging to do environmental law, which is way beyond the scale of the people rubbing nickels and dimes together at the community level to afford somebody to help them, let alone something extended, which can run into now $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 just to have an environmental lawyer look at something. So we said we want to be different. We want to make sure that the groups can enforce the environmental laws and not be stopped by cost from doing so. So we opened up our doors, free legal services, as you can imagine. The line formed around the block, like for free concert tickets, of all the groups that were trying to access free legal services. At one point in time in Pennsylvania, we had over 300 organizations that were our clients who were facing off about various things. And the calls that came into our office would always be the same. It didn't matter whether it was a biomass plant or a oil and gas extraction project or a factory farm or a landfill or water withdrawal. Didn't matter what the issue was. The calls that came in the door were always the same. Somebody would call and they'd say, we live in blank blank municipality and we have plans for a 10,000 head hog factory farm that wants to plunk, you know, right in the middle of our municipality. And our vision of sustainable agriculture here does not include a 10,000 head Smithfield Foods hog factory farm in the middle of the municipality. And the next thing they would say, and they would always say it because, you know, the track of what we're trained to be on, it makes us say it. And they said, well, we want to stop it. We don't want it, right? We want to say no to it. We don't want it here. To which we had to patiently explain to the person on the other end of the line that the law in the United States is set up that if a facility is a legal use, L-E-G-A-L, if it's a legal and permitted use by the state, that the community is banned from prohibiting it, okay? So you know, on this point, we're not the messengers. You know, you ask the corporate lawyers, the environmental lawyers, you'll get the same answer. It's well-settled law and has been so for 200 years in this country. That if you have something that's a legal use, L-E-G-A-L, it's been permitted by the state, therefore been defined as legal, that the community, you living in your community, have no right to ban the use, right? And so we would say to these people calling on the phone, we'd say, well, that's great. We're philosophically with you. We love sustainable agriculture and we love the models for it and we wish that this thing wasn't happening to you. And we also would say no to it if we were living there. But unfortunately, the system of law doesn't allow you to ban it. And so we can help you out in other ways to appeal permits and do that kind of stuff. To which the group would say, well, we can't afford anybody else. so welcome to our community. And we would go in and we would appeal their permit. And regardless of what the issue is, you know, if you're an environmental lawyer, the way you practice environmental law is you take the regulations that apply to a specific facility, you take the application, you compare the two. Because what you're looking for are gaps, omissions, and deficiencies within the permit application. So then you can go in front of a judge and say, Your Honor, section little c, little 2, little I, little Roman numeral 2, little c, little b, little I, little 2 of volume 25 of Pennsylvania statute, section 23. Requires a $1 million bond to be put on for the road for this incinerator that's trying to get a permit from the state. And we would say the application doesn't include that, and therefore you need to throw the permit out. So we would become experts on the minutiae of what had to be in the regulatory stuff, had to be in the applications. And the corporations are pretty sloppy because they don't really give a shit. 95% of all permits are never appealed because nobody has the resources to appeal them. So the corporate boys are pretty sloppy and they'll put in some stuff, you know, it won't be signed correctly or the bank bond won't be in there in a proper amount. Or something else would be missing, like a hydrovertebrate study for a stream or something like that. We would become experts at all of that, which is what environmental lawyers do. So we would pick it apart and we'd go in front of the judge and make the arguments, and most of the time the judge would say, you're right. It's missing this. It never should have been issued to the corporation. I'm going to rule in your favor. I'm going to throw out the permit. What happened next? Well, the community group would call us and they'd be ecstatic. And they would say, we won, right? We came together as a community, we found something here that we didn't like, that we knew we didn't want. We found an environmental lawyer who was half decent. We found a judge that actually understood the arguments. He issued a decision in our favor, and now we're not going to get the 10,000 head hog factory farm in our community anymore. And they'd have a victory party, and we'd go to their house, and we'd have some beer, and we'd have some, you know, snacks, and everybody would pat themselves on the back, and they would say the system works. Well, what would happen 6 weeks later? The corporation would come back, right? And I had lawyers for companies like Waste Management Corporation, because we'd be going after the big guys. They would come up to me after the hearing and actually thank me for finding the missing things. Because then they could bill more to actually track down the missing items to fill in the permit application to then make it bulletproof, right? Because we were identifying the gaps, omissions, and deficiencies. They were coming back and filling them in. Sometimes this game went on 7 or 8 times, which was a lot of billable hours for the lawyers. But eventually they would fill in all the holes. The community group would come back to us and they'd say, Mr. Lindsay, we need you to do that jujitsu again that you did the first time around to actually get this permit kicked. And we would look back at the community group and we would say, well, we're sorry, there's nothing we can do. Because there's no gaps, omissions, or deficiencies anymore because it was now administratively complete. So essentially, We had a win-loss record. We kept record of it back then when it was certain numbers, but it was 130-3 or 130-4, something like that, in terms of win-loss in front of these permit judges and these administrative courts. Because those were the times that we won, that something would be rejected and they have to go back and fill it out again. On paper, we look like the best damn environmental law firm that you've ever seen. But if you actually drove into the communities that we were representing, you would have seen no resemblance whatsoever between the communities and what they were getting and our win-loss record, because they had absolutely no similarity to each other. One group of folks that didn't care that the two were disconnected was the liberal progressive community, who gave us the awards and the recognition and the funding. We got invited by Al Gore's office to the White House one year as one of the best environmental law firms in the country. We went through all that glitz and glamour and being recognized as a career builder and all that kind of shit. But what we recognized eventually was that we weren't stopping anything. We weren't stopping a thing. Right? And sometimes you have a corporation come along and didn't have the resources to go back through the process. That was very rare, but you'd have some of those and you'd actually stop something, stop the corporation. But if you had a company with resources coming in, they would always be able to cite. They would always be able to force their way into that. And two things were said to me at that point in time that I still remember today. One was, at least we thought we were costing the corporations money. Right? Every time we would appeal a permit, they'd have to hire a law firm. It was a big hitting law firm out of Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, something like that, lots of money, that we were penalizing them because they had to spend money. It was at that point that we learned that the monies that they spend on permit defenses is tax deductible. Under US tax laws, a reasonable and necessary business expense, right? And so structurally, they were writing that off as a cost of doing business, those permit defenses. And the second thing she said to me, I think, was the thing that drove the stake all the way in, which she said this. Her name is Jane Ann Morris. She bills herself as a corporate anthropologist, so go figure that one out in your spare time. She said that the only thing that environmental regulations regulate are environmentalists. The only thing that environmental regulations regulate are environmentalists, because they make us predictable. They make us predictable in how we fight. The rules for how we fight have been scripted by the entities who wrote the regulations, which most of the times is the regulated community itself, the corporations. And if we think that the corporations are going to write a script that actually allow us to stop something that they want to put in when they wrote the script themselves within the regulations, then we are the crazy ones, right? Definition of insanity is expecting a different thing, doing the same thing every time and expecting a different result. Well, that's been the history of environmental activism in this country, at least from my perspective. And we need a clean break from that to actually move into other areas that are more worthwhile. So how did we change? Well, we had a bunch of bright people like Jane Ann Morris who were egging us along and watching as we came to these certain conclusions. And we decided to close the office down, to close the legal defense fund out, get rid of it, because we had other things to do. I would have rather worked at a Kinko's than to help corporations build better permit applications, which is essentially what we were harnessed into doing. And before that happened, we started to get different phone calls into the office from folks in South Central Pennsylvania. For folks that haven't been in South Central Pennsylvania, the way that James Carvell described the state of Pennsylvania when he was doing a campaign there was that we have Pittsburgh on one side, Philadelphia on the other, and Mississippi in the middle. And so South Central Pennsylvania is very rural, it's very conservative, it's very Republican. There was a plan back in early 2000 for a bunch of agribusiness corporations to put factory farms throughout South Central PA. We're talking a lot, like 500, I think the original plan was 500 to 600 factory farms. They had been pushed out of South Carolina and North Carolina after the hurricane had uncapped all their manure lagoons, and there were the dead zones off the coast. Temporary moratorium put into place on factory farms in those states. Those factory farms then moved to Pennsylvania. People in the South Central part of the state said, well, we're going to pass local laws that regulate how you can dispose of your manure. And it's never a good issue before dinner, even after dinner, it's not that great. But these hog factory farms produce massive amounts of liquid manure. And not to get into liquid manure weights, but we did for a while. it's very expensive to get rid of liquid manure because it's very heavy. So, you know, in terms of trucking it someplace or doing whatever with it, it's very expensive. These communities in Pennsylvania, about 200 of them, so 200 municipalities in the south central part of the state, had passed laws essentially making it so expensive to dispose of liquid manure to make it cost prohibitive to put factory farms in. Yeah, it's a common tactic of environmental groups, which is to drive ordinances or laws that make it expensive to do whatever is trying to be done as a disincentive to doing it. Well, in Pennsylvania, these communities passed those laws. When the drive came in for those agribusiness corporations to come into south central Pennsylvania, the agribusiness corporations didn't stop at the doorstep of those municipalities and say, oh, well, you've passed those laws, we're going to respect them, which means that we're not going to operate in your community. No. What they did was they went to the state legislature and they had a bill drafted called the Nutrient Management Act, right? And the Nutrient Management Act said, oh, those poor municipalities, they don't have the expertise to administer manure regulations. And in fact, if we want to be pro-business in Pennsylvania, we have to have a uniform regulatory system across the board. We can't have patchwork regulations in different places. It's all the kind of shit that they say about everything, including the GMO preemption bill that passed here in Oregon last year. That, you know, all those arguments came to bear, and they came up with this really fruity little item called the Nutrient Management Act, which preempted all of the ordinances that had been passed on manure management within those municipalities. In one stroke of the legislature, at 2 in the morning, when the Pennsylvania legislature at least does their best work, which is at 2 in the morning, they passed the preemption bill, which overnight made all of those ordinances unenforceable. And the next day it opened the door wide to the corporations to come in and begin setting up those factory farms within those municipalities. The calls we were getting at that point from those municipalities were people who had already gone through the regulatory dance. They had said, hey, we did it. We tried to regulate manure. And what happened was we got overridden by corporate rights. You know, corporations went to a legislature and used their power within the legislature to then preempt us. And so we've been through that fight, that regulatory stuff, and we don't want to deal with that anymore. And they would call us up and they would say, we don't want these factory farms in our community. And we would say, well, that's too bad because they're now legal permitted uses, you know, permit issued by the state. Because it's a legal use, you can't ban what is a legal use within the community. You're banned from prohibiting that. And people on the other end of the line from these south central Pennsylvania communities started asking a question that has been asked ever since, which is, why? Why are we banned from prohibiting a legal use within our community? Why? And we would say, you know, being the clever people that we were, we'd say, well, you can ban it, but then you're going to get sued by the corporation that's affected by what you've passed, who's going to sue your municipality because you're interfering with corporate rights. And the corporate rights that you're interfering with are the fact that that permit from the state is property. And in essence, by passing the ordinance, you are violating their property rights because you're taking their property under the Fifth Amendment, right? It's a vehicle that corporations have used for the last 150 years, which is to sue municipalities to stop them from doing things like banning legal uses. To which usually the people on the other end of the line would throw up their hands and say, okay, tell us what we can do. But instead, something was in the water perhaps, I don't know. But after we got done explaining the corporate rights stuff, the guy on the other end of the line would say, why? Why do corporations have those rights, right? And being the clever people that we were, had been through law school, we were experienced and seasoned people, and we said, well, it's because corporations have constitutional rights, and they have the same constitutional rights as you or I, as persons under the law. Because in the United States, corporations have been recognized as being persons. You know, this is separate from the people that own the corporation having rights. This is the corporate entity itself having rights, have been recognized by the U.S. Supreme Court as being persons. And you may have heard in the Citizens United decision or the McCutcheon decision that just came down that First Amendment rights of corporations have been used to strike down campaign finance laws. That's the mechanism that's used to get rid of those campaign finance laws, with the logic that campaign finance restricts corporate speech, and corporations have speech by virtue of being persons under the law. So that's part of the system that we have now, that corporations are persons. So we would explain all that to the person on the other line, and they would say, why? Why? And we would say, well, it's because in many ways the US Constitution itself puts certain values over others. In other words, the US constitutional structure places property and commerce at a superior level. It's why you have the Commerce Clause within the Constitution, for example, and you have takings law that's built around property and commerce. You have those values up here, and underneath, you don't have any mention in the Constitution, at least, of communities or nature or labor or all those things that we might think that rights of those entities should be superior to property and commerce. So in some ways, the US Constitution is DNA'd to put certain values over others. That's how it was written. And when you go back and read the Philadelphia Constitution Convention minutes, if you ever have a spare moment, light reading, to read through that stuff, you'll you find out that the founders weren't too favorable towards democracy itself, right? That they had put certain things over others within the constitutional structure. So he said, it's not a mistake that corporations were recognized as persons. It was only a matter of time, because corporations are the biggest actors of property and commerce in this country. They are the entities. It's only a matter of time before the biggest actors in property and commercial affairs were actually clothed with the rights that were provided in the constitutional process for property and commerce. It's only a matter of time before those rights, which have been elevated, actually clothe the actors that are engaged in them to protect the actors as well as the activities themselves. So we would explain this to the folks on the line, and they would say, why? Why was the Constitution DNA'd that way? And we would say, well, it goes back to English common law, because English common law, when England was actually setting up colonies, they were colonizing and doing their imperialism dance, that they developed this thing called English common law, which also put property and commerce above the rights of communities, people, and nature. And the folks that wrote the US Constitution thought English common law was the best thing since sliced bread. And they took all the English common law principles and actually drove them into the US constitutional structure. So it should be no surprise that the Constitution turned out the way it is. Okay, the person on the other side said, why? We say, we have no idea, right? It may go back to the Nile. We don't know. But we know that piece. And so as we were explaining to these folks, they continued to come back around and say, well, we don't want the factory farm. So how do we actually begin to change a system of law that's actually preventing us currently from driving towards the type of future that we want to build within our community? And it was there that rights-based organizing was born. The first laws that were produced through the rights-based organizing process dealt with factory farms. They were actually anti-corporate farming laws. So instead of saying we're going to go after odor or flies or manure or water pollution or all the other stuff that's produced by these concentrated animal feeding operations, we're going to go after the corporations themselves, because agriculture in the United States has been corporatized. It's not just a regulatory problem about the regulatory problems caused by these things. Those are just symptoms. The underlying problem is that 4 corporations currently control 80% of pork processing in the United States. 3 corporations control over 70% of cheese production in the United States. And so that corporate concentration, which has created a loss of 300,000 family farmers across the United States over the past 20 years, is a corporate problem, right? It's a democracy problem. It's not a factory farm problem. It's the fact that corporations have the tools to legally define what agriculture is going to look like in the United States. And so the first laws we drafted were called anti-corporate farming laws. They banned certain corporations from farming within those communities. So they were corporate focused. And the laws started to pass in south central Pennsylvania. First 1 community, then 5, then 10, then 20. It started to migrate out to northern Pennsylvania and then out to the wings, eastern and western parts of the state. And as that was morphing, people were having another problem, which was sewage sludge. You know, we were talking about sewage sludge before, after, not so positive either, but sewage sludge is everything that goes into a centralized sewage treatment system. We used to dump it all off the coast of New Jersey. And whoever has lived in New Jersey may think that was a good choice. I don't know. But what happens when you dump shit You know, and it's not just, you know, the waste. It's also the fact that it can contain 100,000 different toxic contaminants in the waste stream. It's everything that goes down hospital waste streams. It's everything in industrial areas. It's everything you put down your sink or your toilet at home. It's that toxic waste stream that emerges. We used to dump it off the coast of New Jersey, and then the environmental groups came up with the brilliant idea of land applying it to land where we grow crops for food, both for livestock and human production. So 60% of all that sludge now gets dumped on land. The corporations make a mint by hauling it from the treatment plants and giving it for free to the farmers on the back end as a replacement for chemical fertilizer. And so sewage sludge became an issue because we've had 2 kids in Pennsylvania die after coming into contact with land-applied sewage sludge. And so communities approached us and said, can we use the anti-corporate farming model to do something about sludging? Because it turns out 2 corporations make 90% of the profits in Pennsylvania off sludge hauling, actually taking it from the treatment plants and taking it to the farmers on the back end. And so we redesigned it to be about corporate sludging, to ban corporations from being engaged in the sludge hauling and use of sewage sludge. And that started to pass. First 10, 20, 30, 50, 70, we were up to 85 municipalities across the state who had banned corporations from bringing sludge into their community. Between the two, the corporate farming and the sludging laws, we were up to about 10% of all of the rural municipalities in Pennsylvania had begun to take a stand against corporations engaged in these different activities. It was then that one of our municipalities got sued. Little place in the western part of the state, small community of about 1,000 people, got sued by a sludge corporation who said, you can't pass that because it violates our corporate constitutional rights. Now, up until the day that lawsuit was filed, we were trying to have conversations with people across the state about why corporate rights mattered, but nobody wanted to hear it. Because what we would get from people is, well, we have a problem with sludge, we're going to ban sludge, we're going to pass a law, this is the United States, we live in a democracy, we can do what we want, we have the legal authority to do what we want, we're going to pass these laws. And when I tried to engage them over corporate rights, their eyes would glaze over. And they would say things like, well, corporate rights, that's something that you might learn in law school or might learn someplace else, but don't bother us with that, right? Because we've already done what we need to do here. Well, the lawsuit coming in the door was a godsend, because it in no uncertain terms in 8 pages actually said, what you've done is illegal and unconstitutional because we are sludge corporations. We are persons under the law, and you have taken our property by virtue of passing your ordinance, right? And so what happened next was that copies of that ordinance began to, the copies of that complaint, that lawsuit began to travel all over Pennsylvania to everybody's fax machines, because that was the internet of the day pretty much. It was, you know, you had the faxes go out and people would get this complaint, they would start actually reading it and they would say, you know, maybe we need to start dealing with corporate rights, because it stops us from doing what we need to do in the community, the future of our community, determining what that looks like in 20, 40, 60 years. It's preventing us from doing that. And so way back in, you know, a couple year after that lawsuit had happened, I was bringing folks up to speed on what was happening in Pennsylvania on these ordinances. And somebody put up their hand and turned out to be the chairman of one of these municipalities. And he said, Mr. Lindsay, if we can pass these ordinances, but they can be challenged and overturned using this corporate rights stuff, don't we actually need to take on that corporate rights stuff? And I said, well, yeah, but it's been law for 200 some years, and it's got roots even further back than that. It's a really big thing, right? And we're a small organization. We were doing everything we could possibly do already, and we just couldn't imagine taking it on. And so I kind of, in a hostile manner, looked back at him and I said, you know, yeah, it's an issue, but what do you want us to do about it? And he said, we want you to go back to the office and draft us an ordinance that strips corporations of constitutional rights within our municipality. And so we said, yeah, we could do that. And so we went back and we drafted the Corporate Rights Elimination Ordinance, which actually refused to recognize that corporations were persons or had certain rights and powers within the municipality. We sent it out back to the municipality, had no idea what they would do with it. Next thing we know, they're advertising it, passing it unanimously, and passing it on to their neighbors. So the neighboring municipality passed it, and then people start using it in combination with the sludge and corporate farming laws to protect it. because in a very logical sense, it was, this is what we want for our community. We have a right to that. And so therefore, we need to actually start removing those hurdles and obstacles that stand in our way between it and us. And so they started beginning to dismantle that kind of thing. Those ordinances began very simple. They were about corporate rights in the beginning. They eventually became about state preemption, about not recognizing the ability of the state to preempt you on certain things, to actually carve that out. Dillon's rule. Dillon's rule is this thing in US law which says that the municipality is a child and the state is the parent, and you can't do anything in your community unless the state has specifically authorized you to do so. So Dillon's rule, we began nullifying Dillon's rule within communities. Pretty soon we had about 150 communities. Then the city of Pittsburgh approached us, our largest municipal client to date. And they said, we don't want to be fracked. There were plans to frack under a Catholic cemetery in the middle of the city, right? That the fracking corporations had signed a lease for. And the city council came to us and we said, well, this is a big deal. You'd be the biggest city we've worked with. And they proceeded to, with our help, draft and adopt an ordinance that creates a local Bill of Rights for the people of the city of Pittsburgh. Right to clean air, clean water, a right to a sustainable energy future, all these rights in a local Bill of Rights. We're used to wrapping our heads around state bills of rights and federal bills of rights, but this is about actually seizing the municipality to drive forward a new platform of expansion of civil, political, and environmental rights at the municipal level. And they recognize the rights of the rivers that flow through the city of Pittsburgh, right? And in addition to that, they stripped the oil and gas corporations of certain constitutional rights within the city of Pittsburgh, right? And so this was a big deal when the city of Pittsburgh not only banned fracking, but did so within a community Bill of Rights process. That was then picked up by other places, including Moore County, New Mexico, which last year became the first county in the United States to ban hydrocarbon extraction within the county. And so different places doing different things. The work is spread outside of Pennsylvania, obviously, to New Mexico, to New Hampshire, where folks are dealing with corporate water withdrawals and unsustainable energy projects that are happening in New Hampshire. Also in places like New York and Ohio that are dealing with fracking. In Oregon, our assistance has been primarily to Benton, Lane, and Josephine counties, who are moving forward rights-based local laws of their own, dealing with pesticides, right to a local food system, banning GMOs, I mean, all those issues that get wrapped up in what a sustainable food system looks like when you actually try to define it by law and create it by using rights-based mechanisms in that law. And just last week, you know, because we've always talked about, you know, people come to us and they say, well, what's the point, right? That's an overriding question that we always get. What's the point, right? For communities to pass these laws if they're illegal and unconstitutional, and the corporate boys can come in or the state boys can come in and undo them when they're passed, if they get passed. And you know, for a number of years we would always cling to, well, we're going to make creative legal arguments and we're going to convince a court to uphold them, and that may or may not happen. I mean, in just last year, a judge in Western Pennsylvania held that corporations were not persons for purposes of the Pennsylvania Constitution in this landmark case that hardly anybody's heard of. But in Western Pennsylvania, a judge actually issued a 25-page opinion that said corporations were not persons for purposes of the Pennsylvania Bill of Rights. It was a huge, you know, huge decision. So there are real, living, breathing, natural person judges out there who are willing to entertain new theories of law about what needs to change. They do exist. Finding them is a problem, but they do exist. So when people say, well, what's the point of all this? Sometimes I've started answering that perhaps much more clearly, which is to say, what was the point of the 4 African Americans sitting down at the Woolworths lunch counter, right? What was the point of that? You know, the elder reverends and the elder religious community urged those kids not to do that. They said, it's too controversial, it's too confrontational, you're going to give us a bad name as part of the civil rights movement, and what's the point? You're going to sit down, you're going to get hauled off, you're going to get arrested. They packed their toothbrushes because they knew that they might go away for a little while, right? They did it for 2 reasons. Number one, it was the right thing to do, right? It was the right thing to do from a moral and ethical perspective, because when you don't act, The system pretends that you're okay with it, right? If you do not speak, your silence is taken to be assent, right, under the system. So there's a reason to stand up and reject something that's so huge that very few people have even tried to take it on before. There's a reason for that. That's why those kids did it, because it was morally and ethically correct. They decided that they had to begin living their lives parallel and in accordance with their value systems, right? That was the first thing. And the second reason was that they thought if they sat down, that others would sit down, right? And so a week after they did the first sit-in at Woolworths, there were 50 other groups that sat in at lunch counters across 2 states, right? Nobody knew that would happen. Nobody could have predicted that it was going to happen, that it was the moment. You don't know that it's the moment until you try to make more moments. You don't know that it's time, right? Because everybody will tell you it's not time. People will tell you you're crazy to try to do something to take this system on in a structural way, right? But they don't know, right? We don't know. We don't know when it's time to do stuff or not, but you find out by doing it, right? You actually make the path by walking it. That's how you do it. And so when people say, what's the point? We say, well, part of the point here is not only doing is morally, ethically right, and also what other people are, doing, and you hope other people will copy it. And, as a side note, the survival of the planet Earth is on the fucking line too, right? That's, it's a small little footnote down here, but yeah, survival is kind of a big thing too, right? But you got another reason, which is we know that local organizing is not going to solve the problem. Local organizing is about finding pockets of people who come together who are philosophically aligned with doing something different and are courageous and brave enough to actually try it, right? That's part of the reason. But the second reason is to build enough pockets so that you can begin seizing the state mechanism, the state governmental mechanism, and changing it, and then eventually changing the federal mechanism. We have a US Constitution that was drafted in the 1780s. It didn't know anything about climate change or deforestation or scarcity of water supplies, didn't know any of those things. The Constitution was written to accelerate the exploitation of natural resources as quickly as possible. Because the folks in the 1780s said, we're looking across the landscape and see an endless bounty of natural resources. How do we become like Europe? And the way we become like Europe is actually to write a system of law that protects the exploitation of resources the quickest amount possible. And God damn it, they did a really good job, right? Because we're following that course now. That's the straitjacket that provides the law that we are currently within. And so, building upwards means we have state stuff to change, we have federal stuff to change. None of it changes unless you push it to change, whether you force it to change. It's not going to change by writing letters to Congress. It's not going to be changed by begging your environmental agencies to do the right thing. None of it's going to change. You know why? Because it works for certain people. It works for those folks who can use those levers. It works for the folks in Salem. It works for the folks that have the power to use it. It doesn't work for you. We have people coming to us all the time saying the regulatory system is broken. It's not working. It's not broken. It's working perfectly, right? It's not broken. It's working perfectly. Just last week, we won a case in the Colorado Supreme Court. Yay. In Colorado, the overwhelming issue there is fracking. So fracking for oil and gas. A little community called Lafayette, the city of Lafayette, rose up and actually drafted a charter amendment, a Bill of Rights, that was to amend their charter in the city of Lafayette to ban oil and gas extraction within the city. It won by 68% of the vote, right? Passed through the city of Lafayette. The next thing that happened was the corporation that was affected and its trade association, the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, sued the city of Lafayette, sued the municipal corporation, right? And so the people within the city of Lafayette said, well, wait a minute. We thought the problem was the corporation. The problem is kind of the corporation. But there's a bigger problem here, which is that our own governmental system has enabled the corporation to do what it wants to do within our municipality. So in Colorado, they have a preemption law for oil and gas. which the corporation comes in to enforce and says, well, Colorado has preempted local control over oil and gas. In doing so, they, of course, enable the corporation to use that preemptive law to sue the municipality. We treat corporations mostly as private actors, but they're not. They're empowered by the very state government that gives them life. Corporations, to be chartered, have to be chartered through the state. Our state governments give them life. They issue the charter. In addition, corporations wouldn't have constitutional rights, except they've been given those rights by our federal courts, and in some ways by our state legislatures and federal legislatures. The corporations and the state are one. They form what we call the corporate state, right? The corporate state. It's one and the same, right? So the folks in Lafayette said, wait a minute, we thought the corporations were a problem. Turns out they're really not. We need to do something about the real issue here, which is the structure itself, that we don't even control our own state government at this point. And so they drafted a new state initiative, which would legalize the ability of municipalities, people within communities, to actually pass bills of rights at the local level and to redefine corporate rights and powers within those municipalities. And in addition, to exempt it all from preemption, so it couldn't be attacked by preemption when municipalities move forward to do these kinds of laws at the local level. It is the first state initiative to emerge from the various community rights networks that have formed in the 8 different states where we work, where a critical mass of communities has come together to form those state organizations. Eventually, that has to happen in Oregon. State initiative in Oregon to actually recognize the right of local self-government at the community level in the state of Oregon. It has to happen everywhere. And in addition, the federal constitutional structure has to change, because we can't build sustainability within a constitutional structure that was envisioned in the 1780s to do something much different. And so this October, we have folks coming together from the 8 community rights networks that have formed in the states to actually sit down and talk about what a new federal constitution might look like, right? In Oregon, the Oregon Community Rights Network, which is one of the 8, has been created by the counties and the people within those counties who have been active in moving initiatives forward, moving local laws forward. Primarily, the point of the spear has been Benton, Josephine, and Lane counties. So we're going to hear in a couple minutes from folks from those counties talking about what's happening there, but keeping in mind all the time that this model of change, which, you know, we call it a model, it's really not a model at all. It's just a way of thinking about things. It's almost like pretending that we're in the Matrix. You know, for those folks who have seen the movie The Matrix, that there's a lot of pretend stuff that's existing around us, and sometimes we have to take the right pill to dispel that stuff. And we have to do so in the face of other environmental activists, many of whom are our friends, who tell us that we're nuts to move outside the system. That we have to use the stuff we have. We have to do the hand-to-hand combat of the tools that we've been given to stop imminent harms without moving to the structural stuff. They'll say, well, that's great, but we got to do the hand-to-hand stuff now because this is happening and we'll do that stuff later. Well, later never comes. And the story that I was always told by Richard Grossman, who spoke quite a bit throughout Oregon, who was my mentor in doing this work with the Program on Corporations, Law and Democracy, he used to open up these talks with a story where there were a group of hikers going through the woods, and they come upon a river, and one of them looks in the river, and there's a baby floating in the river, floating down the river. And the hiker, you know, he takes off his backpacks and he says, my God, there's a baby floating down the river. We got to get the baby out of the river. We got to get the baby out of the water. And he jumps into the river. He throws off his pack, he jumps into the water, and he grabs the baby and he brings it over to the edge, to the bank, and he pulls the baby up onto the stream bank. And it says, thank God, you know, we pulled that baby out of the water. That's, you know, we had to do that. It was a great thing. And they look in the river, and there's another baby coming down, right? And then another, and another. And the hikers, you know, throwing off their gear as quickly as possible, and they're jumping in the water, and they're grabbing the babies, and they're pulling them to shore, and pulling them up on the stream bank, and bringing them to safety. And there's another baby coming down, and another baby coming down, and another baby. And they're all, that's what they're doing. They're pulling the babies out of the water and dragging them over the stream bank. And they look up at the bank where they've been putting the babies, and they see one of their buddies, and he's got his backpack on, and he's walking away. And they say, what the fuck are you doing? We got to pull these babies out of the water. They're coming down faster now than ever. And the guy looked back at him. He goes, I'm going to go upstream and stop whoever's putting the babies in the water. Right? This is about doing that work. This is about a new civil rights movement that's beginning to emerge across the United States. It's based on community rights, moving forward to sustainability. And I am proud to be here to speak to you tonight, but also to support the efforts of those folks in Oregon communities that are leading, that are the leading part of the spear in driving this stuff into Oregon, because I think it's very exciting. Thank you.